right. Well, good morning, everyone, and thank you so much for coming along to this talk. And a big thank you to Sam for organizing it. I am a PhD researcher at the University of Edinburgh, and my research is concerned with drawing links between the detective fiction of Agatha Christie and the 19th century New Woman movement, with the aim of establishing Christie as a second-generation New Woman. So I know a lot of Christie fans here will have known her work, whether it's on the page or through film and TV adaptations since they were very young. She's quite ubiquitous in British culture, if that's where you're from. But I actually came across Christie for the first time in an undergraduate course on mystery and horror, where the murder of Roger Ackroyd was on the mystery section of the syllabus, though of course the iconic gut punch ending is certainly horrifying in many ways. So while my primary research isn't particularly looking at Gothic or horror elements in Christie's work, with the amount of murders under her belt, horror is an emotion that she regularly evokes. The reason I chose both Christie and the New Woman as part of my PhD research, despite being relatively unfamiliar with Christie at the time, was my fascination with popular culture and its position in society, but more specifically in academia. So popular fiction and genre fiction, though it's gaining interest, has been relegated to the sidelines in many academic settings, which is baffling because it is often the work with the greatest readership and therefore largely influential to the cultural milieu. Fortunately for us, Christie was very secure in the genre she was working in and the audiences she was attracting, and was fully content with being the purveyor of picturesque country houses, middle-class comforts, and characters that were allegedly so steeped in stereotypes that they were unlikely to shock or surprise. As a result, it has been argued that what crime fiction truly offered its readers was the reassurance that whosoever sought to upset the established order would inevitably be discovered and punished. Some such comments suggest that in terms of literary merit, Christie was already beginning with a handicap. However, as scholar Clapton points out, the fictional world, however stylized and parodic, where almost all of the players are suspects and almost none without some form of transgressive behavior or desires, hardly suggests a society at peace with itself. So while there is an element of fantasy involved in the solving of the criminal puzzle, the crime itself is a reflection of wider cultural anxieties, which lends the text an appropriate amount of realism for the audience. This is not unlike what we see in Gothic fiction, where the supernatural ambiguities of many Gothic texts allow the author to simultaneously provide the readers with escapist fantasy, while also subversively addressing very real cultural anxieties. I would argue that Christie uses similar tactics, particularly in her Poirot short stories and novels, to provide only the illusion of escapism. So while superstition and the supernatural do not feature in a large number of Christie's texts, they are almost always disputed in the end, with the narrative providing a perfectly logical explanation for the mysterious events. However, there are those select texts where a paranormal influence is undisputed, and one of them, a short story titled In the Glass Darkly, is the first text I will be looking at today. When I say the title In a Glass Darkly, most fans of the Gothic immediately think of the Champagne collection of stories, which gave us the iconic lesbian vampire story Carmilla, as well as classics like Green Tea and The Watcher. While there is no concrete evidence that I could find that Christie was a fan or overtly familiar with Le Fanu's work, the identical titles speak to an ongoing legacy that Christie has inadvertently drawn herself into, or I am drawing her into. Thematically, Christie's In a Glass Darkly is a Vertigo-esque short story of self-fulfilling prophecy that is an outlier in many ways with the rest of her oeuvre. It was first published in Collier's Weekly in America in July of 1934 and Women's Journal in the UK in December of that year. Its position as an outlier becomes clearer when we see where it fits in notable Christie anthologies. So it is the only story in the anthology, The Regatta Mystery and Other Stories, not to feature one of her detectives or a detective at all. In the posthumously published Miss Marple's Final Cases and Two Other Stories, it is one of those other stories that seemingly has nowhere else to go in Christie's vast bibliography. As of 2019, however, it has found its spooky companions in The Last Seance. Narratively as well, we see how the story allows Christie to engage with ideas that go against her traditional fare of whodunit puzzles and employ ideas of terror more overtly from the very first lines. So this is how the story starts. I've no explanation of this story. I've no theories about the why and wherefore of it. It's just a thing that happened. All the same, I sometimes wonder how things would have gone if I'd noticed at the time just that one essential detail that I never appreciated until so many years afterwards. If I had noticed it, well, I suppose the course of 3 lives would have been entirely altered. Somehow, that's a very frightening thought. Immediately, we are placed in a state of suspense. We are told there will be no explanations, no resolution, nothing that we associate with an Agatha Christie mystery. There is also the allusion to chance and fate, the one detail missed that could have changed the course of those 3 lives, which implies a lack of control and free will. So spoiler alert, full summary coming up, and spoilers for all the texts as well. So the story begins in 1914, just before the war, says the unnamed narrator, who is invited to his best friend Neil Castlake's house, Badgeworthy. The two have known each other for an unspecified number of years, since they were at school with Neil's older brother, Alan. Twice he was supposed to spend the holidays with the Castlakes, but something or the other had intervened, and he was 23 years old before he finally visited the old home. As a result, there's already an air of mystery surrounding the building for our narrator, who has been waiting and envisioning it for a long time. When he finally sees it, he describes it as the kind of house one expected to meet ghosts in the passages, to which his friend replies that there have been stories, but the family have never witnessed anything of the sort. As the narrator is getting dressed, he sees in the mirror a door at the back of the bedroom open to reveal another room, and at the foot of the bed, a tableau of a man strangling a woman to death. For at the foot of one of those beds was a girl, and round her neck were a pair of man's hands, and the man was slowly forcing her backwards and squeezing her throat as he did so that the girl was being slowly suffocated. I could see the girl's face clearly, her vivid golden hair, the agonized terror of her beautiful face slowly suffusing with blood. Of the man, I could see his back, his hands, and a scar that ran down the left side of his face towards his neck. Here, once again, we have a typical Gothic image of a beautiful woman in danger, suffering at the hands of an unknown assailant with only one clear identifying feature, which is a scar down his face, the universal symbol of the damned. Having discovered that the woman in his vision is his best friend's younger sister, Sylvia, and that her fiancé had a scar down the left side of his face, the narrator eventually confesses what he sees to the woman before he leaves Badgeworthy. Through his overwhelming concern for her safety, he also comes to fall in love with her. She breaks off her engagement, he goes off to war. They eventually reconnect after her brother Neil's death and marry, though his jealousy and possessiveness is too much for her, and they grow apart. When Sylvia returns to Badgeworthy one day to care for her other brother, the narrator follows her, believing her to be having an affair with a younger acquaintance, and their confrontation gets violent. She had just changed her frock for dinner, I remember, when I burst into the room. I can see her face, startled, beautiful, afraid. I said, "No one but me shall ever have you, no one." And I caught her throat in my hands and gripped it and bent her backwards. And suddenly I saw our reflection in the mirror, Sylvia choking and myself strangling her, and the scar on my cheek where the bullet grazed it under the right ear. No, I didn't kill her. The sudden revelation paralyzed me, and I loosened my grasp and let her slip onto the floor. Realizing his folly, he breaks down, with Sylvia comforting him, and they reaffirm their love for each other. The little detail that would have changed the course of the lives that was mentioned at the beginning was, of course, the narrator's failure to take the inversion of the mirror into account. The scar he thought was on the left side of the assailant's face was on the right, a bullet that had grazed the narrator in the war. Mirrors and mirror images have long been a conduit for supernatural influences in literature and myth, and In a Glass Darkly is Christie's own unique engagement with that idea, as it poses the question, are the past and the future all one? Was the man who saw the assault the same man who committed it? The narrator admits to being changed after his initial interaction with Sylvia. He's racked with guilt over ruining her engagement, and the only way he feels he can atone is to distance himself from her. Surrounded by the violence of war, he admits that he wanted to be killed instead of living without her. And at the same time, once he had her, he was so afraid of losing her as easily as her ex-fiancé had that it led him to excessive amounts of paranoia and jealousy. It wasn't until he sees his reflection in the mirror as he's hurting her that he's able to shake off that feeling. One thing did that night, he says, the devil of jealousy that had possessed me so long. Despite the torment caused and the narrator's haunted start to the story, one might argue that whatever supernatural forces governed the mirror were benevolent towards the narrator in a rather twisted way. After all, the mirror was the arbitrator of the supernatural event that triggered the plot. Without it, he likely would not have intervened in Sylvia's relationship or even developed feelings for her at all. In effect, the mirror showed the narrator an alternate, darker version of himself, much like a Dorian Gray figure. In this instance, however, rather than driving him to a life of crime and violence, it is this mirrored image that prevents him from killing his wife, drawing him back from the darkness. There is a sense of the story coming full circle, where the trauma that brought this couple together in the first place is what helped them find and trust each other again years into their marriage. In that sense, I would say that this is an emblematic Christie conclusion, where violence and violent events unite people rather than break them apart. Which is why I also find it wonderfully ironic that it is her supernatural horror-inflected work that does not actually have a murder in it, which might suggest, as said earlier, the idea of a twisted benevolence from the spirit world. At the same time, it also plays into the theme common to both Christie and Gothic fiction, which is the idea that it is the human that is monstrous, rather than the unknown supernatural other. For while there are supernatural elements at play here, the only devil that is referenced came from within the narrator, the very human emotion of jealousy. The idea of the monstrous human is going to carry on in the next story I would like to look at, which also includes one of our favorite detectives, Mr. Hercule Poirot, and it's called The Adventure of the Egyptian Jew. This text brings about a number of different ideas with regards to Christie's relationship with the Gothic and how the themes and motifs of the supernatural are conveyed in a colonial context. And I'd like to start by talking a little bit about Christie's relationship with what was then broadly known as the Orient, but specifically the Middle East. As I mentioned earlier, despite maintaining her stance as a writer for entertainment only, Christie's books are extremely socially and politically aware, and the fear of the foreign other was a common motif in her books. The empire under which Christie was writing was no longer at the height of its power, and its decline is reflected in Christie's texts. She prided herself in writing stories that appealed to a large demographic, and one of the ways in which she achieved this was by updating the threats in her mysteries to reflect the anxieties of her readers. As C.H.B. Kitchen observed, changes in the world situation and domestic scene have left their mark, and few writers are more aware of these changes and record them more shrewdly than Mrs. Christie. In some ways, I would argue that Christie's stories are like the empire themselves. They encounter natives in their own countries in exotic Middle Eastern and Oriental landscapes, but they also have to deal with the consequences of immigrants and refugees migrating to the quote mother country. They are paupers, aristocrats, bureaucrats, and businessmen. In her later novels in particular, Christie also addresses ex-colonial leaders and military personnel, addressing their role in the imperial project. Christie's own relationship to the empire is an interesting one, as she was an avid traveler and had lived and worked in many of the places she was writing about, building ties with the people and the culture. That is not to say that she was wholly sympathetic towards these people, more so that her prejudices are informed in different ways. Christie's representations of Eastern cultures and nationalities can be divided into three major categories: the Arab, the Greek, whose appearance is often coupled with the Turkish, and the Jew. While the latter two make regular appearances in Christie, we only ever encounter Arab citizens in their homeland, most commonly Egypt, Baghdad, Iraq, and Syria. This is a notable change from her usual style and has to do with a growing fascination towards the fictionalized Orient that developed in the 20th century. Traditional detective stories took place in the countryside, in a secluded upper middle class setting, which included the killers, who were rarely of a lower class than their victims. However, as the genre of detective fiction developed over the 20th century, the exoticism of foreign lands compelled authors like Christie to situate their narratives abroad. They also provided additional sources of mystery and evil by virtue of being the other amidst the close-circle societies of English travelers and expats. The Adventure of the Egyptian Tomb is one of the earliest of these works and was first published in an anthology, Poirot Investigates, in March 1924. This image, by the way, despite looking uncannily like David Suchet, is in fact the original dust jacket from the first edition print of Poirot Investigates, and it always thrills me how similar they look. In The Adventure of the Egyptian Tomb, Poirot is hired by a Lady Willard, whose husband had recently discovered the tomb of the pharaoh Menher-Ra, quote, one of those shadowy kings of the 8th dynasty when the old kingdom was falling to decay. Not long after, Sir John Willard dies of a heart attack. A fortnight later, his partner, Mr. Bleibner, dies of acute blood poisoning, and his nephew in New York shoots himself. Naturally, this brings forth a fury of speculation into the superstition surrounding forbidden Egyptian treasures. John Willard's widow, concerned for the safety of her son, who has taken over his father's work, hires Poirot not only to get to the bottom of what is causing the deaths, but because he is, quote, a man of original views, with imagination and experience of the world. Poirot reaffirms her belief, assuring her that he too believes in the power of superstition, calling it one of the greatest forces the world has ever known, and promises to do everything humanly possible to protect her son. Poirot and Hastings set off for Egypt the very next day. Christie's depictions of the East are relatively unembellished, but no less layered. There is a manufactured dichotomy between West and East, Orient and Occident, orderly and intractable. We see in this passage Poirot's disdain for the unruly sand and unevenly growing palm trees. Even the pyramids, though he concedes that they are of a shape solid and geometrical, the unevenness of their surface is most unpleasing. Christie's focus in her Middle Eastern texts lies with issues of nationalism and imperialism, and how the relationship between East and West presents itself in her novels. There is a sense of superiority exerted over the locals, a supercilious acknowledgement that the West possessed what Edward Said refers to as executive responsibility towards the colored races, hints of which can be seen in this passage. Arriving at the camp, the pair are informed that there has been another death, this time due to tetanus. Poirot appears to truly entertain the possibility of a potential curse, much to the chagrin of the camp doctor, Dr. Ames, and the emissary from the British Museum, Dr. Toswell. There's an oppressive feeling of dread in the air that has as much to do with the historical setting of the land they're on as it has to do with the murders themselves. As they retire to bed that first evening, the group spots a shadowy figure moving between the tents, Anubis, the god of departing souls, who they see going into Dr. Ames's tent and effectively marking him as the next victim. However, it is Poirot who ends up unconscious after drinking chamomile tea made by the Willards' local servant. Of course, knowing the detective, we should expect that he is always one step ahead of the killer and had faked his poison. The killer in this instance was the camp doctor, who swallows a cyanide pill as soon as he is confronted, taking his own life. Poirot admits to having one of the servants dress as Anubis to see if there was any chance that the doctor did truly believe in elements of the supernatural. He concludes that Ames had been using his medical knowledge to aggravate existing illness in the deceased or directly poison them in order to gain Mr. Bleibner's fortune. The death of Sir Willard was a trial run to stoke hysteria around an ancient curse, after which Dr. Ames could pursue his intended victims unsuspected. As Poirot expounds on his belief in the supernatural, he clarifies, "I believe in the terrific force of the supernatural. Once get it firmly established that a series of deaths are supernatural, and you might almost stab a man in broad daylight and it would still be put down to the curse. So strongly is the instinct of the supernatural implanted in the human race. I suspect from the first that a man was taking advantage of that instinct." The dichotomous notion of the East being both an influence on immorality as well as a scapegoat for Western evil is brought up throughout Christie's Middle Eastern novels. In Appointment with Death, the killer takes advantage of the dismissive attitude towards the locals by assuming the disguise of a servant, which almost allows them to get away with the crime. After comments about how all Arabs look alike and the prevalent belief that they are anonymous masses rather than individuals, Poirot catches the killer because they're the only suspect to give a detailed description of the mysterious servant. This is just one example of how Westerners could be tempted into adopting some of the immoral practices commonly associated with the Orient. In Death on the Nile, Lynette Ridgway ends the servant Marie's relationship with a man after discovering that he had a wife already and 3 children. The man, Fleetwood, who was English, had married an Egyptian woman, a wife of color, a wife of this country, they say. And when they realized the marriage was unsuccessful, separated, but were not divorced. Living in the East, therefore, did not just compel one to commit adultery, but also engage in bigamy. In the same novel, Rosalie Otterborn also expresses feelings of restlessness brought about by being in the East. There's something about this country that makes me feel wicked. It brings to the surface all the things that are boiling on the inside. Everything's so unfair, so unjust. Rosalie's complaints are about her mother, a failed romance novelist and alcoholic. Like Fleetwood, Mrs. Otterborn had thrown all caution to the wind in the East, wearing turbans and talking of sex and desire openly, not something her daughter or traveling companions approved of. For Mrs. Otterborn, the Orient was a place of freedom and discovery, functioning as surrogate space for where Westerners may project onto the people and environment their basest desires, be it cruelty, violence, or decadence. As they say in Appointment with Death, there are such strange things buried down in the unconscious: a lust for power, a lust for cruelty, a savage desire to tear and rend, all the inheritance of our past racial memories. They are all there, Miss King, all the cruelty and savagery and lust. We shut the door on them and deny them conscious life, but sometimes they are too strong. Dr. Gerard's observation here not only speaks to the complexity of human nature, but also twists it into a racial argument. In connecting negative emotions to past racial memories, Dr. Gerard is implying that certain races, specifically Western European races, have evolved enough to abandon their primitive urges. This also reinforces the killer's belief that if they disguise themselves as a local servant or invoke an ancient curse, as was the case in the Egyptian tomb, no one would question it because they believed that the Orientals as a race had not evolved enough to overcome these violent urges. However, as we reach the conclusion of the novel, we see how, in true Christie fashion, there is a twist. Despite a murder taking place, it was committed by a Westerner and not the Arab servant as suspected. By subverting her audience's expectations in this manner, Christie is leading the reader to question the degree to which the West had truly evolved. Of course, not all depictions and references to the Orient were threatening or immoral. Christie's texts were not immune to the romantic appeal of the exotic Orient landscapes. As Hastings observes in Egyptian Tomb, the excavation site was a wonderful place and a wonderful work. I can feel the fascination. This desert life, this probing into the heart of a vanished civilization. Surely, Poirot, you too must feel the charm. This was a result of the West's preoccupation with depicting the Orient as a historical entity, frozen in time. Orientalism assumed an unchanging Orient. The notion that the Orient is immune to change comes from the tradition of a binary thinking that situated it in direct contrast to the Occident or the West. James Balfour, a key contributor to British Orientalism, saw what he called the Orientals as a, quote, subject race, long past their prime, useful in the modern world only because the powerful and up-to-date empires have effectively brought them out of the wretchedness of their decline and turned them into rehabilitated residents of productive colonies. Much like Christie's texts, such thinking revealed more about Western concerns of how society was evolving than it did the East. That is to say, by situating the Orient in the past, as Balfour did, the West was able to positively reflect on their own strides towards civilization and credit themselves with bringing the Orient, as Said says, out of the wretchedness of their decline. While The Adventure of the Egyptian Tomb does not dwell on this idea much, Christie's interwar novels do possess a similar atmosphere with regards to the Middle East. a sense that you have stepped back in time upon leaving the West. This is predominantly the result of a deep interest in archaeology and how that translates to her work. Not only do excavation sites feature prominently in the text, but ancient ruins and monuments are the central focus, even in modern cities. Middle Eastern history is reduced to popular tourist sites where a number of Western travelers go to encounter the historical Orient. The treatment of these places as a tourist attraction, combined with the importance of an archaeological perspective, confers upon them a sense of exotic otherness. The Orient becomes a museum of itself, preserving the treasures of the past for outsiders to observe and study at their leisure. The timelessness adds to the exoticism and mystery of the East, which in turn is used to construct striking imagery by Christie, as we see here. Sarah King stood in the precincts of the temple, the Hamaref Sharif. Her back was to the dome of the rock. The splashing of fountains sounded in her ears. Little groups of tourists passed by without disturbing the peace of the oriental atmosphere. Strange, thought Sarah, that once a Jebusite should have made this rocky summit into a threshing floor, and that David should have purchased it for 600 shekels of gold and made it a holy place. Aided with historical and archaeological knowledge, King is able to recreate the Orient of the past, a common feature in these novels. The subject of plundering the land is at the forefront of the text, presented unequivocally through the prevalence of archaeological sites, and was clearly defined in her first Middle Eastern novel, Murder in Mesopotamia, in 1936, where the murder investigation takes place in tandem with the ongoing excavations. The use of Mesopotamia, which officially became Iraq in 1921 in the title, further reinforces the feeling of the Orient being frozen in the past and immune to change. Murder in Mesopotamia, more so than the other novels, uses the landscape of the Orient as a plot device. This is specifically in reference to the setting, which most closely resembles that of the traditional detective novel, including a close excavation community, with most of the action revolving around that specific site. The Oriental surroundings help add an exotic flavor to this otherwise traditional detective story, with detailed descriptions of excavations and the fantastic stories behind the ruins. The tendency to remain in the past is characteristic for archaeologists, who have little time for the here and now in Christie's books. As Mrs. Leidner observes of her husband, archaeologists only look at what lies beneath their feet. The sky and the heavens don't exist for them. The archaeologist's preoccupation with the past is not only justified, but venerated in these texts. However, that is not to say that all sense of wonder has been lost just because the novel focuses on more material treasures. There is a childish wonder in the way Christie describes some of the archaeological practices that reveal her genuine fascination with the occupation. Dr. Leidner and Mr. Mercado cleaned some pottery, pouring a solution of hydrochloric acid over it. One pot went a lovely plum color, and a pattern of bull's horns came out on another one. It was really quite magical. Christie shows high regard for the occupation, no doubt inspired by her first-hand experiences on such digs. There is little concern shown for the present state of the Orient, not when archaeologists can so skillfully resurrect treasures of the past, giving Western audiences more artifacts to admire. Post-colonial critics identify the study of archaeology as a conduit for promoting imperialist ideology, and Christie's Oriental novels are full of archaeological discourse. The process of uncovering and restoring ancient monuments was then used by the West to frame the East as an underdeveloped land. The West was an agent of progress, whereas any progress made by the East was in the ground. This further helped justify colonial rule in the East by implying that it is only because of the goodwill of Western archaeologists that these artifacts are being uncovered. Native residents were thought to be apathetic about their own heritage and needed the West to help them realize its worth. Christie touches on this when discussing payment for local diggers. You have to pay the workmen who find the weight of the object in gold. Good gracious, I exclaimed. But why? Oh, it's a custom. For one thing, it prevents them from stealing. You see, if they did steal, it wouldn't be for the archaeological value, but for the intrinsic value. They could melt it down. So we make it easy for them to be honest. Historicizing the Orient does not always take place in the ground, however. Death on the Nile projects a more glamorous Oriental past inspired by the trend of Egyptomania and built on images of pyramids, sphinxes, and pharaohs. Egypt in Death on the Nile is depicted as one large archaeological site to be marveled at, specifically in contrast to Western civilization. Landmarks are not necessarily admired for their place in Egyptian history, but for their impact on Western emotion. Visiting an unnamed temple in Death, we see the full impact of the grandeur of Egypt and how it affects the travelers on the Karnak. Cornelia Robson is the first to comment on how big and peaceful it looks. Quote, "Looking at them makes one feel that one's so small and rather like an insect, that nothing matters very much really, does it?" Even the usually uninterested Simon Doyle, who is not much of a fellow for temples and sightseeing, has to admit that a place like this sort of gets you, if you know what I mean. Those old pharaohs must have been wonderful fellows. Doyle's sudden appreciation for the pharaohs, after encountering a monument worthy of his attention, demonstrates the transactional nature between the West and the East. Much like the diggers in modern Mesopotamia, Doyle only appreciates the temple for its material and not historical value. The temple is a magnificent structure, large and imposing. It is not simple pottery or a modest but valuable trinket. Doyle's approach for appreciating only the grandest monuments further reinforces the Orient's position as a passive attraction, meant for the enjoyment and amusement of the West. Tourist itineraries in Christie's works do not restrict themselves to a single country, but are dedicated to exploring multiple historical sites throughout the Middle East, moving quickly with little time afforded to travelers to acquaint themselves with the local people and cultures. In Appointment with Death, for instance, Mr. Cope discusses his schedule, which involves a few days in Jerusalem, followed by a thorough exploration of the Holy Land, Bethlehem, Nazareth, Tiberias, the Sea of Galilee, after which he hopes to visit Roman ruins in Jerash, and finally the rose-red city of Petra. This is a characteristic portrayal of the Orient in Christie's works, where various Middle Eastern countries are depicted as a homogeneous entity, comprising only of tourist destinations for the pleasure of the traveler. They hold the power wherever they go, and the indigenous population is once again rendered powerless, another attraction to be enjoyed and critiqued by the tourist. Another way in which the tourist industry plays an important role in asserting Western ownership over Eastern history and cultures is evident in the few instances where we see locals in positions of power, specifically as tour guides. Their expertise is constantly brought into question, if not completely disregarded. Moreover, they are specifically overlooked in favor of travel guides like the Baedeker, produced and published in Germany. This is a clear example of the West writing Oriental history and blatantly flaunting it in opposition to indigenous knowledge. We have this quote here from Appointment with Death, and "She prattled on until the dragoman in charge called a halt and began to intone. This temple was dedicated to Egyptian god Amun and the sun god Re-Harakte, whose symbol was the hawk's head. It droned on. Dr. Besner, Baedeker in hand, mumbled to himself in German. He preferred the written word." Christie applies several methods to deliver the image of an exoticized and fantastical Orient, including mystification, archaeology, and tourism. I would argue that Christie's texts demonstrate a natural progression towards a more modernist Oriental discourse, which uses established institutions like archaeology and tourism to establish the inferiority of the Orient. As we move into her post-World War II era of publication, we come across more instances of European othering in her writing, with a number of instances of anti-Semitism and phobia. Thus far, we have seen how racism was created by and for European communities in order to establish themselves as morally and biologically superior, enabling them to colonize and exploit multiple countries and continents. I have focused on Western white Europeans as a single homogeneous group, mainly because their interests and motivations often align during this period. However, despite their shared beliefs on inferior races, there grew even amongst them a racial hierarchy. Certainly, people of color, including African, Native American, and Middle Eastern groups, would be at the bottom of that ladder, but stratifications at the top were not uncommon. In conclusion, I hope this talk has highlighted some of the ways in which Christie's texts are influenced by and in conversation with Gothic tropes, and how she adapts those tropes to fit within her signature whodunit structure of the detective story. There is a lot to consider with a figure like Christie and her complexity as a writer, who both challenges and perpetuates imperialist trauma in a unique manner, playing into her strengths of final twists in order to prey on her readers' prejudices, while also exposing some of her own. Her interactions with the supernatural, while relatively subdued, show a fascination for the subject and how it affects the human psyche, which has been key to her detective fiction as well. So, a lot to consider, a lot to think about and examine further, given the vast breadth of her work, but I am going to leave it at that for now. So thank you to everyone for listening, and I look forward to chatting with you all.